In 1906, miners hit something at Bingham Canyon that wasn't supposed to be there. 300 feet below the copper deposits, they found worked stone. Not ore, not natural formations, chambers with tool marks that predated the mine by centuries. Within 48 hours, 3 separate shafts were sealed with concrete. The foreman's log from April 14th mentions structural anomalies requiring immediate closure for safety. By April 21st, those same shafts had been filled and the coordinates scrubbed from official survey maps. The Bingham Canyon mine is now the largest man-made excavation on Earth. You can see it from space. But nobody talks about what the original crews found before the industrial operation began. And nobody explains why a copper mine needed to seal off sections that contain no copper at all. If you're into mysteries that official history won't touch, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed discoveries, architectural anomalies, and the stories that don't make it into textbooks. Now, to understand what happened in those sealed shafts, you need to know what Bingham Canyon was before it became a mine. The Awkward Mountains where Bingham Canyon sits have been inhabited for over 8,000 years. The Fremont people, then the Shoshone, considered the canyon sacred. Their oral histories describe it as a place where the old ones built into the mountain, long before their ancestors arrived. The Shoshone had specific warnings about certain areas of the canyon. Tribal elders told early settlers that some sections were forbidden, not because of spiritual taboos, but because people who entered certain caves didn't come back the same. They spoke of stone rooms that sang, and tunnels that went down forever. Those warnings were documented in the journals of Jedediah Smith, the first American explorer to traverse the region in 1826. Smith noted that his Shoshone guides refused to approach the western face of the canyon, claiming it was a place of the ancients, not meant for the living. When Mormon settlers reached the area in 1848, they found something strange. The canyon already had excavations, small test pits, sure, but also larger openings that showed evidence of metalworking far older than any Native American activity in the region. Brigham Young surveyors noted worked tunnels of unknown origin in reports from 1850. One surveyor, a man named Erasmus Snow, went further in his personal correspondence. In a letter to his brother dated November 1851, he described finding a shaft descending at a precise angle, its walls bearing chisel marks of such uniformity that no hand tool could have made them. We dropped stones and counted to 30 before hearing them strike bottom. That's over 400 feet deep. In 1851, cut into solid rock with precision that shouldn't have been possible with the technology available to pre-Columbian cultures. These weren't natural caves. The walls were too uniform, the angles too precise. By the 1860s, small-scale mining operations started pulling copper and silver from surface deposits. The deeper they went, the more inconsistencies appeared. Miners kept hitting voids that shouldn't exist in that geology. Spaces that had been deliberately carved out, then backfilled with material that didn't match the surrounding rock. In 1896, the Boston Consolidated Mining Company bought up claims across the canyon. Their geologist, Samuel Newhouse, wrote in a private letter to investors about pre-existing excavations of considerable age interfering with our survey grid. That letter is in the Bancroft Library archives at UC Berkeley. I found it 3 years ago while researching unrelated mining records. Newhouse recommended against deep drilling in certain sections. He marked them on maps as unstable substrate. But the term he used in his field notes was different. Chambers, artificial origin. Extent unknown. Nobody listened. By 1903, industrial operations were underway. Steam shovels, dynamite, the kind of extraction that doesn't stop for historical curiosities. Then came April 1906. The first discovery happened on April 11th. A drilling team working the southwest face, about 280 feet down, broke through into a cavity. Not a natural fissure. A rectangular space, roughly 12 feet high, extending back into the mountain in a straight line. The drill operator's name was Clayton Moore. His account, recorded in a later deposition for an unrelated lawsuit, describes what he saw when they lowered a lantern into the opening. The walls were smooth, dressed stone fit so tight you couldn't slide a knife blade between the blocks, and there were markings, not Indian markings, symbols I'd never seen running in bands along the ceiling. Moore's crew reported the find to the shift supervisor, a man named Holloway. Holloway went down himself with 2 engineers. They spent 4 hours inside that chamber before coming back up and immediately wiring the Boston office. What happened next is where the story gets deliberately vague in official records. The mine's daily operations log for April 12th through April 14th is missing from the archives. Just those 3 days. Every other day in 1906 is accounted for. Those 3 pages were removed, and the binding shows they were cut out carefully, not torn. But we have the personal diary of one of the engineers who went into that first chamber. His name was Robert Ashworth, and his granddaughter donated his papers to the Utah State Historical Society in 1978. She had no idea what was in them. Ashworth wrote that the chamber extended at least 200 feet into the mountain. The walls weren't just smooth, they showed evidence of tool marks consistent with advanced metalworking. Circular saw patterns in granite, precision cuts that would require diamond-tipped industrial equipment that didn't exist in the 1800s or the 1700s, or, according to conventional history, any time before the 20th century. Ashworth describes finding 3 distinct layers of construction. The outermost layer was the dressed stone blocks. Behind that, a second wall of what he called fused material, neither stone nor metal, but something in between. And behind that, a third barrier they couldn't breach with the tools they had on site. On April 13th, 2 more chambers were discovered. One directly below the first, accessed by what Ashworth called a descending corridor with steps too wide for normal human stride. The second was in the north face at a depth of 310 feet, and it was different. This one had artifacts. Ashworth's description is precise. He was an engineer trained to document what he saw without embellishment. He describes finding metal implements that showed no rust despite obvious age. Containers made of a ceramic material he couldn't identify, and a series of stone tablets carved with the same symbols they'd seen in the first chamber. The metal objects were particularly anomalous. Ashworth noted that they appeared to be made of an alloy he couldn't classify, not bronze, not iron. When struck, they produced a tone that resonated for several seconds, like a bell, but deeper. One piece was shaped like a cutting tool with an edge that was still sharp enough to scratch steel. The ceramic containers had a strange property. They were translucent when held up to lamplight, revealing internal structures that suggested they had been moulded or cast rather than hand-formed. Some contained residue that Ashworth described as crystalline powder, white with hints of blue, that left a metallic taste when accidentally touched to the tongue. He took samples. Those samples were confiscated when the chambers were sealed. One of the tablets had a diagram. Ashworth sketched it in his diary. It shows a cross-section of the canyon with multiple levels of chambers connected by vertical shafts. The diagram indicated at least 7 levels descending over 800 feet. But there was more to that tablet. Around the edges of the diagram were what appeared to be numerical notations. Ashworth, who was fluent in multiple languages and had studied ancient mathematics as a hobby, recognized the numbering system as base 12, not base 10. Duodecimal counting, the kind used by the Sumerians and Babylonians thousands of years before the Common Era. Why would a structure in Utah use a mathematical system from ancient Mesopotamia? That charming drawing stayed hidden in Ashworth's personal effects for 72 years. On April 14th, the company's response team arrived from Boston. Not more engineers, not geologists, a crew of specialists whose names don't appear in any company registry. They brought equipment that Ashworth didn't recognize and orders that came directly from someone high enough in the organization that even the site manager deferred to them without question. The chambers were closed, all 3 of them. The first was filled with concrete mixed on site, poured until the opening was completely sealed. The second and third received the same treatment, but with one addition. Before the concrete went in, crews installed heavy iron doors at the chamber entrances. Then they poured the concrete behind the doors, effectively entombing whatever was inside. Ashworth writes that he and the other witnesses were told to sign confidentiality agreements, not standard safety waivers, legal documents specifically forbidding them from discussing what they'd seen in the chambers under penalty of breach of contract and immediate termination. Moore, the drill operator, refused to sign. He was let go the next day. By 1907 he was working in a silver mine in Nevada, and he never spoke publicly about Bingham Canyon again. But here's what makes the cover-up obvious. Those shafts weren't sealed because they were unstable. The canyon had plenty of unstable sections, and the standard procedure was to shore them up with timber supports or simply reroute the excavation. Concrete was expensive. Sealing off entire chambers with it was a last resort, used only when a section was deemed permanently unusable. Yet the sealed chambers were in areas rich with copper ore. The geological surveys from 1905 specifically noted those sections as high priority for extraction. Closing them off made no economic sense unless what they contained was more important than the copper they could have mined. The company's official explanation, filed with the Utah Mining Commission in May 1906, states that structural instabilities and gas pocket risks required the permanent closure of 3 exploratory shafts for worker safety. There's no mention of chambers, no mention of artifacts, nothing about the weeks of activity that followed the sealing, when crews were observed removing crates from the sealed areas and loading them onto rail cars bound for parts unknown. A supply manager's ledger from the Salt Lake Rail Depot, discovered by a researcher in 2004, shows an entry for non-standard freight, Boston Consolidated, destination unlisted, 14 crates, weight 840 pounds each, handling instructions, fragile antiquities. Fragile antiquities from a copper mine. But there's more in that ledger. The entry notes that the shipment required specialized loading equipment due to unusual weight distribution, and that 2 of the crates were emitting low-level heat, cause unknown. The depot supervisor who signed off on the shipment added a handwritten note in the margin. Crew reported discomfort when handling crate Mar 7 and number 9, tingling sensation in hands, rotated workers every 15 minutes as precaution. Whatever was in those crates wasn't just old, it was active in some way that made early 20th century railroad workers nervous enough to document it. The material removed from those chambers before they were sealed went somewhere. The rail records stop in Salt Lake City, but secondary shipping manifest suggests the crates were transferred to a private freight line heading east. After that, the trail goes cold. However, there's one intriguing clue. In 1908, 2 years after the Bingham Canyon sealing, the Smithsonian Institution received an anonymous donation of pre-Columbian artifacts of uncertain origin, according to their acquisition records. The donation was substantial enough to warrant a special storage designation, but curiously, there's no itemized list of what was donated. The acquisition number assigned to that donation, SI 1908-47, doesn't appear in any public catalogue. When researchers have requested access to materials under that number, they've been told the items are in conservation or under review for authenticity. That status hasn't changed in over 100 years. Now let's talk about what those chambers actually were. The architectural style Ashworth described doesn't match any known Native American construction. The Fremont people built pit houses and granaries. The Shoshone used temporary structures. Neither culture worked in dressed stone blocks with precision joinery. But it's not just the style, it's the engineering. Ashworth documented joint tolerance of less than 1 millimeter between stone blocks weighing several tons each. That level of precision requires not just skill, but measurement tools accurate to fractions of an inch, and lifting equipment capable of positioning massive weights with surgical accuracy. The ancient Egyptians achieved similar precision at Giza, but they had thousands of workers, decades of time, and a centralized state apparatus to support the effort. Who had that infrastructure in pre-Columbian Utah? The symbols Ashworth sketched in his diary show geometric patterns similar to pre-Columbian Central American iconography, but with significant differences. Some researchers have compared them to ancient Phoenician or even Proto-Sumerian writing systems, though the connection is speculative at best. What's interesting is that similar symbol sets have appeared in other anomalous North American sites. The Grave Creek stone from West Virginia, discovered in 1838. The Back Creek stone from Tennessee, found in 1889. The Los Lunas Decalogue stone in New Mexico, which bears Paleo-Hebrew script and has been carbon dated to anywhere between 500 BCE and 500 CE, depending on which expert you ask. All of these artifacts suggest contact between the Old World and the Americas long before Columbus, and all of them have been dismissed, ignored, or locked away by mainstream archaeology. The Bingham Canyon symbols fit that pattern. They suggest knowledge that wasn't supposed to be here. What isn't speculative is the construction technique. The fused material Ashworth mentioned appears in other anomalous sites around the world. Vitrified stone created by exposing rock to temperatures above 100 degrees Celsius. The process requires sustained, controlled heat that ancient cultures supposedly couldn't generate. Yet it shows up in Scottish hill forts, in the Sahara Desert, and in certain megalithic sites across Europe and Asia, and now apparently 300 feet below a mountain in Utah. The most famous examples are the vitrified forts of Scotland, over 60 sites where stone walls have been melted and fused together. The conventional explanation is that timber structures built against the walls caught fire and generated enough heat to vitrify the stone. But experiments attempting to recreate this process have failed. You can't generate the sustained, even temperatures needed just by burning wood against stone. You need something more, something that could produce industrial level heat in a controlled manner. The tool marks Ashworth described present another problem. Circular saw cuts in granite require industrial diamond-tipped blades running at high RPMs. Hand tools, even bronze or iron chisels, leave different patterns. Linear grooves from repeated strikes, not the smooth uniform arcs of rotary cutting. Modern geologists who have examined similar cut marks in other ancient sites, like the granite boxes in the Serapeum of Saqqara in Egypt, have confirmed that the precision and uniformity of the cuts are consistent with machine tooling, not handwork. If what Ashworth saw was accurate, whoever built those chambers had technology that wouldn't be reinvented until the early 20th century. There's another detail in his diary that most people miss: the steps too wide for normal human stride. Ashworth was 6 feet tall, and he writes that he had to stretch uncomfortably to go from one step to the next. That puts the rise at somewhere around 18 to 20 inches per step. Standard human stride is built around steps of 7 to 9 inches. Anything above 12 inches becomes difficult to climb without using your hands. Steps designed at 18 to 20 inches suggest either a completely different approach to stair construction or builders who were significantly larger than modern humans. And before you dismiss that as impossible, consider that skeletal remains of individuals over 7 feet tall have been found in burial mounds throughout North America. The Smithsonian documented dozens of such finds in the late 1800s. Then most of those records quietly disappeared from public access. Newspaper accounts from the era are more forthcoming. The New York Times reported in 1885 on the discovery of a human skeleton of gigantic proportions in West Virginia, measuring over 8 feet in height. The Worthington Advance in Minnesota reported multiple giant skeletons discovered during mound excavations in 1883. The Madison Democrat in 1882 described a skeleton of unusual size found in Iowa. These weren't tabloid sensationalism, they were mainstream newspapers reporting on archaeological finds that were being sent to the Smithsonian for study. So where did those skeletons go? The Smithsonian claims they were either misidentified, lost, or destroyed in various fires and accidents over the decades. But researchers who have filed Freedom of Information Act requests for records related to these acquisitions have hit walls. Many records are listed as missing or transferred to unknown storage. The pattern is consistent with what happened at Bingham Canyon. Document the find, ship it to a central authority, then make it disappear from public knowledge. Now, what about the tablets? Ashworth's sketch shows a diagram of the canyon with multiple levels. If that diagram was accurate, there are at least 4 more chambers still sealed beneath the current mine floor. Bingham Canyon has been excavated to a depth of over 4,000 feet since 1906. The mine is now a terrace pit nearly a mile wide and half a mile deep. If those deeper chambers existed, they've either been destroyed by the ongoing extraction or they were carefully avoided during the expansion. Given what happened in 1906, I'd bet on the latter. There are areas of the current mine that have never been touched despite containing viable copper deposits. Sections where the excavation patterns curve around certain coordinates for no apparent geological reason. I've compared modern satellite imagery with the original 1905 survey maps, and the deviations are consistent with avoiding specific underground structures. It's possible the company knows exactly where those chambers are and has been mining around them for over a century. In fact, there's evidence this is exactly what's happening. Mining engineers who have worked at Bingham Canyon, speaking off the record, have described encountering no-go zones where drilling is prohibited without explanation. One former supervisor, interviewed in 2011 for a documentary that never aired, said that certain grid coordinates were marked in red on internal maps with the designation Legacy Restriction. When he asked what that meant, he was told it was related to historical survey errors that could compromise structural integrity if disturbed. But when he checked the geological data for those zones, they showed solid, stable rock with high copper content. No reason to avoid them unless there was something else there. Another former employee, a drill operator who worked the mine from 1987 to 2003, reported that his crew once hit a void at a depth of 520 feet. They were immediately pulled back. The hole was filled with concrete and the drilling pattern was rerouted. He was told it was a legacy issue and to include nothing about the incident in his daily report. A void at 520 feet. Below the areas where the 1906 chambers were sealed. Exactly where Ashworth's diagram predicted there would be deeper levels. But why? If they're just empty rooms, why not excavate them and move on? If they contain artifacts, why not study them or at least document them properly? The answer might lie in who owned the Boston Consolidated Mining Company in 1906. The majority shareholder was a man named William Rockefeller, brother of John D. Rockefeller. The company's board included members of the Guggenheim family who controlled much of the American copper industry at the time. These weren't small-time prospectors, they were industrialists with connections to the highest levels of government and academia. But there's more to the Rockefeller connection. William Rockefeller was deeply involved in what was then called industrial archaeology, the practice of studying ancient construction techniques to improve modern engineering. He funded expeditions to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Peru specifically to document advanced construction methods used by ancient civilizations. In 1904, 2 years before the Bingham Canyon discovery, Rockefeller donated funds to establish the Department of Archaeology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. One of the department's first projects was cataloging anomalous American artifacts that didn't fit conventional historical timelines. The department's archives are still restricted. Researchers need special permission to access them, and even then, certain collections are marked as under review indefinitely. The Guggenheims had similar interests. Daniel Guggenheim, who served on the Boston Consolidated Board, was a trustee of the Smithsonian Institution and personally funded several archaeological expeditions in the American Southwest between 1902 and 1910. The artifacts collected during those expeditions were supposed to be catalogued and displayed. Most of them never were. If they found something in those chambers that challenged the accepted history of human civilization in North America, they had both the resources and the motivation to bury it, literally. And they had the infrastructure to do it quietly. The Rockefellers and Guggenheims controlled mining operations, railroads, museums, and academic institutions They could move artifacts, seal sites, and suppress information without raising public suspicion because they owned every link in the chain of custody. There's a pattern here that shows up across multiple sites. When evidence emerges that doesn't fit the established timeline, it gets categorized as an anomaly, dismissed as misidentification, or simply removed from public access. The Smithsonian's missing giant skeletons. The Newark Holy Stones found in Ohio and declared fraudulent despite no credible evidence of forgery. The Michigan relics, thousands of artifacts suggesting pre-Columbian contact with Mediterranean cultures, all locked away and ignored. Bingham Canyon fits the pattern. Discovery, documentation, immediate suppression, but unlike those other cases, we have names. We have dates. We have the engineering logs, the personal diaries, the shipping manifests. The evidence wasn't completely destroyed. It was just buried under a century of industrial progress and corporate silence. So what's still down there? If Ashworth's diagram is accurate, there are chambers at depths the mine hasn't reached yet. The current excavation is moving laterally now, expanding the pit's diameter rather than going deeper. But the mine has at least another 20 years of operation ahead of it, and eventually they'll need to go down again. When they do, they'll either find more chambers or they'll conveniently avoid them like they've been doing since 1906. The other question is what happened to the artifacts that were removed. 14 crates, 840 pounds each. That's over 6 tons of material. It went somewhere, and it didn't just disappear. Private collections are one possibility. The early 20th century was peak era for wealthy industrialists building personal museums of archaeological curiosities. Most of those collections were never catalogued publicly, and when the collectors died, their estates were broken up and sold off piecemeal. University archives are another option. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton all have basement storage facilities filled with undocumented artifacts from that era, material that was donated or acquired under vague circumstances and never properly studied. Or the artifacts could be in government storage. The Smithsonian's warehouse facilities contain millions of items that have never been displayed or researched. Some of those items have restricted access for reasons that aren't publicly explained. If I had to guess, I'd say the Bingham Canyon material is sitting in a crate somewhere, labelled with a catalogue number that doesn't appear in any public database, waiting for someone with the right clearance to decide what to do with it. But there's one more possibility that nobody wants to consider. What if the chambers aren't empty? What if sealing them wasn't about hiding artifacts, but about containing something that was still active? Ashworth mentions in his diary that the innermost barrier, the one they couldn't breach, had a quality he struggled to describe. He writes that it seemed to hum when approached, a vibration felt rather than heard. That detail gets ignored in most retellings of the story. It's too weird, too unscientific. But Ashworth was an engineer. He didn't deal in mysticism or exaggeration. If he wrote that something was vibrating, he meant it literally. There are other sites around the world where similar phenomena have been reported. Ancient chambers that emit low-frequency sounds when certain conditions are met. Structures that seem to interact with electromagnetic fields in ways we don't fully understand. If the Bingham Canyon chambers had some kind of active component, something that posed a risk the company couldn't quantify, sealing them makes a different kind of sense. Not suppression for historical reasons, but containment for safety. Of course, that raises the question of what kind of ancient structure could still be active after centuries underground. And that's where we move from documented history into speculation. I'm not going to tell you it was aliens or lost civilizations with advanced technology. I don't know what built those chambers. Nobody does, because the evidence was sealed away before it could be properly studied. What I will say is that the official story doesn't hold up. The economics don't work. The timeline doesn't work. The behavior of everyone involved, from the company executives to the government officials who approved the closures, suggests they were dealing with something they didn't want the public to know about. And here's the thing that should bother you. Bingham Canyon isn't unique. Similar stories exist for other mining operations in the American West. The Comstock Lode in Nevada, the Homestake Mine in South Dakota, the Anaconda Copper Mine in Montana, All of them have reports from the late 1800s and early 1900s of crews finding chambers or artifacts that didn't fit the expected geology. All of them sealed those sections and moved on. The Comstock lode discovery is particularly well documented. In 1877, miners working at the 900-foot level broke into a chamber containing what they described as ancient metalworks and tools of unknown manufacture. A report filed with the Nevada Mining Commission mentions the find but provides no details about what was discovered or what happened to it. The chamber was sealed 3 days later. At Homestake in South Dakota, workers in 1901 discovered what they called worked tunnels of great age at a depth of 1,200 feet. The mine's geologist at the time, a man named Edward Pierce, wrote in a letter to colleagues that the tunnels could not have been natural formation and showed evidence of intelligent design and execution. Those tunnels were mapped, photographed according to Pierce's notes, and then closed off with concrete. The photographs, if they still exist, have never been made public. The Anaconda mine in Montana has the strangest story. In 1889, workers found a chamber containing what the shift foreman described as a great wheel of stone, perfectly circular, mounted on an axle of unknown metal. The wheel was approximately 8 feet in diameter and showed signs of having been used for grinding or milling. That artifact was removed from the mine and shipped to an unknown destination. There's no record of what happened to it after it left Montana. 3 different mines, 3 different discoveries, all sealed or removed within days, all involving powerful mining companies with connections to the same financial interests that controlled Boston Consolidated. It's a pattern, and patterns don't emerge by accident. Someone, or multiple someones, made a decision that certain discoveries weren't meant to be public knowledge. They had the authority to enforce that decision across multiple states, multiple companies, and multiple decades. That level of coordination doesn't happen unless the stakes are enormous. So what were the stakes? What could possibly be worth suppressing evidence across an entire industry for over a century? The simplest answer is that it challenges the foundation of how we understand human history in North America. If there were advanced cultures here before the accepted timeline, it rewrites everything. It means our ancestors weren't the first to achieve industrial-level construction and metalworking. It means the narrative of linear progress from primitive to advanced doesn't hold up. And if that narrative breaks down in North America, what does it mean for the rest of the world? How many other sites have been sealed, buried, or explained away because they didn't fit the accepted story? The more you dig into this, the more questions emerge, and the answers, if they exist at all, are locked away in places most of us will never access. But the Bingham Canyon mine is still there, still operating, still excavating millions of tons of rock every year. And somewhere below that massive pit, sealed under concrete and a century of silence, are chambers that somebody decided we weren't allowed to see. Maybe one day someone with access and courage will decide the truth matters more than the cover-up. Maybe those chambers will be reopened and their contents finally studied properly. Or maybe they'll stay sealed forever, and the only record of what was found in 1906 will be scattered diary entries and shipping manifests buried in archives nobody thinks to search. Either way, the story exists, the evidence exists, and no amount of concrete can bury a question once it's been asked. What did they find in Bingham Canyon in 1906, and why did it scare them enough to seal it away forever? If you want more stories about suppressed discoveries and historical anomalies that don't make it into textbooks, subscribe. I dig through archives, shipping records, and forgotten documents to find the things they don't want you asking about. Next week, I'm covering the Manhattan tunnels sealed during subway construction in 1904 and why 3 blocks of the original excavation were filled with concrete and erased from city maps. Click the video on screen now.